Day 5 of the Cairns Cup saw tons of drama over the board as we had several players missing wins in their games, as the current Women's World Championship challenger Tan Zhongyi continues to lead the event with 3.5 out of 5 as we cross the halfway mark of the tournament. Jumping into the results, we had all draws today, though not by design, as all 5 games could have easily become decisive. But with all draws, that means Tan Zhongyi keeps her half-point lead over Mariya Muzychuk and Harika Dronavalli with 3.5 out of 5 going into the rest day tomorrow. Going into the games, we'll start with the game between Anna Muzychuk against Tan Zhongyi. This one started off as a Caro-Kann advanced variation, and out of the opening, it seemed like black was doing all right here. We have trades on d5, a trade of light squared bishops, rook c8, knight e2. But here black goes for queen a5 check and queen a6, inviting this endgame with the doubled a-pawns, which Muzychuk does go for. Then she plays rook to c1, takes, and black was playing quite quickly here, indicating that Tan here was in her preparation. But after f6, knight d3, takes, it seems like white was already getting actually a very nice endgame here. The engine suggests maybe knight to b8 followed by knight c6 might have been better for black. Instead, we see takes, and knight b6, which the computers do not like, instead suggesting knight c5, king e2, where white already has a small edge. After knight to b6, however, bishop to b4, knight c4, king e2. Muzychuk plays this part very, very well. Now b3, interesting decision to give up the a-pawn, but she ends up winning it back with rook to a1, rook takes a6, and in fact, white ends up getting the extra pawn here, rook takes a7. However, this endgame does end up being kind of tricky to convert. She pulls the rook back, g3, rook to b6, and here rook a8, this is where Muzychuk basically goes wrong. She gives up the b-pawn in order to play rook h8 and go after the h-pawn, but the issue is that black puts the bishop on e7 and now gets counterplay with this very nice move rook a6, and now the rook is entering in on the a-file, and this basically gave enough counterplay for black to hold this endgame, despite white still having the extra pawn at this point. Black's rook and bishop get very, very active here, and already at this point, black had enough to secure the draw, and the players did repeat moves here with the perpetual check back and forth. So going back, what Muzychuk should have done rather than going for the h-pawn was just keeping her rook on the a-file, for example, rook a4, defending the b-pawn, followed by king to e3, king to d4, maybe pushing on the king side somewhere, and white would have had very reasonable winning chances here. So it was this decision that ends up allowing Tan Zhongyi to possibly escape in today's game. Going to the next game between Irina Krush against Kosteniuk. This one started off as a Nimzo Indian, and this one also was actually quite solid for some time. In fact, as we get into the middle game here, it was actually black that was a little bit more comfortable in this position, with white having a weakened structure. Of course, 2 bishops advantage for white, but after queen g4, f5, it really was black that was doing well here. However, after the following moves, trades on c2, a6, knight d4, queen to b3, queen f7, rook d1, e5, knight e2. Here Kosteniuk goes for the c-pawn with rook takes c4, probably missing Krush's response. Queen takes b6, a fantastic tactic. If knight takes b6, white has rook takes d8 check, queen f8, black has to give the queen back, and so white gets the material back, but then the killer move rook to b1 at the end of the line with the idea to play bishop a3 check, and black has huge problems on the b-file, and this is a very, very nice endgame for white. White is likely just winning material at this point. So after queen takes b6, Kosteniuk defends with rook to b8, but now queen d6, bishop c6, and white's pieces break into the position. Just a fantastic advantage here for white. With opposite color bishops on the board, this always favors the attacker, and it's definitely white's pieces here that end up being very, very strong. However, knight takes b5. Now we get bishop versus knight, and Krush goes for the back rank and does get a winning position here, realizing that rook c2 check, king to g3, white's king is safe here. It's black's king that's in danger, and Kosteniuk has to pull back here with queen to f7, h4, h6, and this is the moment where Krush goes wrong. She spends a lot of time and goes king h3, rook to c1, and now bishop to d6, basically giving away the win. The problem after bishop d6 is black has rook h1 check, king g3, and now f4. Very, very clutch resource from Kosteniuk. Any way that white takes this pawn, black is going to give queen g6 check, followed by queen to c2 with a perpetual. And this is exactly what happened, and a draw was soon agreed. So going back, what white should have done, instead of bishop d6, she had to move queen to d6. And the idea is just to freeze black, put a lot of pressure on this knight, and then prepare the advance to play e4, just running the e-pawn up the board. This likely would have won the game. White can also do this without king h3, for example, queen d6 here, followed by e4. And it seems like this should be enough to win the game. Of course, there might be some more tricks. It would be complicated. But yeah, this is where things went wrong. After king h3, bishop d6, black had this fantastic resource. And just like that, the game was drawn. Moving on to the next game between Zatonski against Paehtz. And in this one, the drama was actually more towards the end of the game. This one starts off as a Bogo Indian defense, and a very, very solid position here for black as a lot of pieces get traded off early on. Bishop takes c8, rook takes, now b3, g6. Maybe black had a chance here with d5, looking for play on the c-file. So we get g6, knight e4, rook to d1, and very, very solid play from both sides. a3, looking for some play on the a-file. Takes, and the game basically stayed pretty even at this point. Maybe it's actually white that is a little bit better, because long term, black does have some weaknesses on the queen side. And eventually Zatonski does find the right plan, trading off this knight on d3. And at this point, white has a very pleasant position with queen and rook against queen and rook. But after queen d4, queen to g7, the players end up repeating here. Queen e3, queen g7, queen d4, queen g7, and a draw is agreed here as well. Zatonski not having a great event. We can understand the draw from her. But actually, white was doing well here had she decided to play on. Instead of repeating with queen to d4 at this point, g4, a very nice option for white, with the idea to take on f5. For example, if black was to pull the king back, white could take on f5, go king to h2, bring the rook to g1, and black has a lot of weaknesses in the position that white can target here. So this actually was a nice chance for white. Perhaps f takes g4, hg, and then queen to h4 might be a concern, but f5 and both g5 here are good for white. Let's say g5 check, for example, king to g7, and then white just has to deal with this threat, some move like king to f1, and white would have a very, very comfortable game here and some decent winning chances. But hard to see all this over the board, and we did get a draw agreed. Moving on to the game between Mariya Muzychuk against Harika Dronavalli. This one started off as an Italian game. We actually haven't seen too much of this opening in this tournament. And once again, this game started off quite solidly, but eventually black does run into some trouble here. Despite the opening going completely fine for black, we see exchanges on d5, on d4 as well, bishop to e6, bishop c2. Actually, maybe white could have taken this one, but there are some tactics on the f-file after f takes c6 and f2 is hanging. So bishop c2, bishop d7, bishop e4, knight f6. We get some trades on f5, takes, and we reach this endgame, which doesn't seem that dangerous for black. But after knight to b3, black really should have played this move a5, not allowing white to fix the structure. Instead, we see knight d5 and a5. Doesn't seem like a big deal, but now white's knight is getting to c5, and this is actually kind of annoying. The b7 pawn is a serious weakness. So knight f8, knight c5, and at this point, Harika makes the move knight e6. Very, very surprising decision, just giving up a pawn on the spot. The engines actually don't love black's position here. They suggest something like rook to e8, which also leaves the b pawn hanging. But here, at least if white takes and takes on b7, they would of course have to allow black's rook to get in. Here, black would have some possible compensation. Instead, knight e6 allows white to just pick up a pawn for free, and white definitely has a huge advantage at this point. It's just a free pawn, not much compensation here for black. But things end up going wrong for Muzychuk during the conversion process. She goes for this plan on the queen side with rook b4 and c4, and this allows black actually to get pretty active with the pieces. Nice move here found by Harika, knight to d5, using the pin on the 4th rank in order to hit the rook and trade off white's strong bishop on e3. After the bishops come off, now black is just a pawn down in a rook and pawn endgame, which is not as scary as it was before. And from here, the trend is definitely in black's favor as she activates the rooks, and now rook to d4. And at this point, black is getting the pawn back and the players actually found the repetition right off the bat. White is no longer having any winning chances at this point, so definitely the right time to pull the brakes and make the draw. So how did White miss out on her chances in this one? Probably should have kept the rooks in the center of the board, something like rook to e6 here, threatening bishop takes h6, and followed by just advancing on the king side, perhaps g4, king to g2, king to g3. This seems to be a decent plan for White to, of course, keep some very, very serious winning chances alive in the position, and ultimately should be a winning endgame for White, but a lot of work to be done. Finally, we get the last game to finish of the round, and possibly the most dramatic, between Alice Lee against Nana Dzagnidze. This one was quite interesting. Starting off as a Catalan, here Alice plays a pretty topical line. She does win back the pawn on c4, but actually Black ends up equalizing here after White's move queen to b3 and e4. Probably not the most accurate for this position. Dzagnidze finds a nice move c5, the idea to break open the bishop on the diagonal. After takes, knight takes e4, Black wins the important e-pawn, and at this point Black is already doing quite well in the position. So takes on b6, there's no knight takes b6 here because of a check on the diagonal, picking up the loose knight. So instead, queen to f3, knight d7, bishop f4, b5, and at this point, yeah, Black is already doing well. In fact, the engines really like knight takes e5, followed by rook to d8 in this position, with a big advantage for Black, where it's hard to develop the knight for White. If knight to c3, then b4 comes, and so on. Instead, we saw bishop f6, knight takes d7, queen d7, knight c3. Black definitely keeps an advantage here, and after knight takes f4, Alice decides to take with the pawn. She could have taken with the queen as well, but likely she didn't want to give up this check on the diagonal, either queen to c6 or queen to b7. That also looks very unpleasant for White. So instead, gf4 is played, but of course this weakens the structure long term, and eventually we do get into an endgame here, but as you can see, all of White's pawns are very weak, and this causes some long-term issues. So lots of maneuvering here from the players. Bishop f6, queen d6, queen c6, rook to c2, rook c7. Eventually we do get the endgame here, and now Dzagnidze starts trying to win this one, the two rooks and bishop against the two rooks and knight. So more maneuvering to follow. Alice defending this one very well on the increment. The players at this point just have a 30-second increment, no second time control. Dzagnidze had a time advantage going into the endgame, but at this point both players are down to just a couple minutes. So we do see a pair of rooks come off the board, and Black continuing to make progress. A lot of small advantages in the position for Black. Better minor piece with the bishop versus knight, better structure as well. Now here Alice makes a clever decision to play f4, and this is a pawn sacrifice, but it makes the rest of Black's pawns very weak. And it might have worked out for her, although she doesn't quite follow it up in the best way. Apparently the move h4 here would have been quite nice for White, looking to lure Black's king to the h-file, and then White can kind of play against this king. Instead we see the king going back and forth. But ultimately a very difficult endgame for White to hold, especially on the increment. And eventually Black does break through, getting the rook to the d-file, bishop c3. The king is also able to get in, and at this point things start looking very nice for Black. So Black is able to pick up this h-pawn and have 3 passed pawns on the king side. But Alice keeps fighting, knight d2, knight f3, rook check, king f1, bishop a7. And at this point, the game gets very sharp as White goes rook takes f6, rook takes b3, and rook takes f4. Apparently, knight takes h4 might have drawn the game for White. Of course, if Black takes with the king, then White can take the pawn on f4 with a check. And then we get the famous rook and bishop against rook endgame. This one is a draw with best play, although of course the game would continue for another 50 moves, and it's definitely not the easiest endgame to hold. Of course, Black doesn't have to take the knight on h4. After knight takes h4, probably either king to g4 here or bishop to b8 is a better try, and then the game would very much continue, and of course Black would have very serious winning chances. However, instead we see rook takes f4, which looks great except for king to g3, the very serious double attack. And now this one is tough for White, because if rook takes h4, then Black is taking this knight with a check, and White is losing the rook on h4. So rook f2 check, followed by king takes h4, and it's game over. But both of these pieces are hanging, and black is looking to take the knight on f3. So if white moves the rook, then rook takes f3 check, takes, and we do have the wrong color bishop with the rook pawn, but the problem is that white's king is cut off. So if white's king was on h1, this would be a draw. Keep this in mind. However, since white's king is on f1 and cut off from the corner, black is of course completely winning. So after king to g3, Alice finds the only chance, knight to d2, counterattacking the rook. King takes f4, knight takes b3, and now h3. And so also very precise play from Dzagnidze here, finding the only way to get a winning position. Keep in mind both players playing on the increment here. Now the issue is that black wants to play king to g3 and h2 and just promote the pawn without allowing king to g2. So knight to d2. If black moves the king in right now, there's going to be knight e4 check, and white is actually saving the game. So black has to play bishop to d4 or make a move with the bishop first, playing for Zugzwang. Knight c4 was played, king to g3, knight d6. Now if h2, there's going to be, again, knight e4 check. And the problem is the king can't stay on this square. So king h3, knight g5 check. As soon as the king moves up, king to g2, white is saving the game. As soon as white gets king g2, king h1, it is going to be a draw. Black just can't win the endgame. So black doesn't push. Instead, calm move king to f3, now threatening h2 as there's no knight checks. Knight f5, the last try from Alice, looking to either take or give a check. And at this point, all black needs to do is back the bishop up. Bishop to b6, bishop to c5. All these moves are working because the threat is h2. If knight h4 check, the king can come to g4 and the knight has to move back. And now finally black can play h2 here, and that's it. Sorry, not h2, excuse me. King to g3 followed by h2. You can see how complicated this endgame is, and that's it. White isn't able to get the king back in time, and the knight is also stuck, not able to give any useful checks. Instead, in the game, black played the move bishop to f2, which seems to be very reasonable as it also covers knight h4 check. Or does it? Alice finds the move knight h4 anyway. And now the problem is if black takes this knight, well then king to g1, white's king is getting into the corner and saving the game. But why is this such a big deal? Well, now the issue is that the bishop on f2 is hanging. So if black plays king g3, or let's say king to g4, then white takes the bishop immediately and makes a draw in the king and pawn endgame. And if king to g3, well then there's knight f5 check, and there's no way to avoid the checks without allowing white to take the bishop. So this would just be a draw. So in the game, Dzagnidze ends up taking on h4. There's no other try but king to g1, king to g3, king h1. It's a theoretically drawn endgame. She doesn't really try. There really are no tries. Anything that you try to do is just going to lead to a stalemate. So Nana decides to end the game right away. And we had our 5th draw of the day. So very, very dramatic day. You can see there was a lot of missed wins in today's action. Almost every game actually could have been decisive at one point. But sometimes that's how chess plays out. It is a very difficult game. So that takes us into tomorrow's rest day. Round 6 will take place on Wednesday, June 19th. We've got the following matchups: Alice Lee White against Irina Krush. We have Kosteniuk White against Muzychuk. Mariya Dzagnidze White against Zhongyi. Paehtz White against Anna Muzychuk, and Harika White against Anna Zatonski. Should be another very, very interesting round, and hopefully we'll see you back here for the recap. Until then, take care.